Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1119th New Social Environment. I'm Magali, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Andrea Geyer and Ksenia M. Soboleva. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Andrea Geyer is a multidisciplinary artist engaging queer methodologies and unsensing the construction and politics of time. Her lens-based works activate the lingering potential of specific events, places, or biographies, materialize the entanglement of presence and absence due to ideologically motivated omissions from archives and memories. And our host today is Dr. Ksenia M. Soboleva, a New York-based art historian specializing in queer art and culture. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, with a dissertation on art, AIDS, and lesbian identity in the United States. Soboleva is currently working on a book project titled Friendship as a Way of Art, Queer Identity and Visual Citation, and co-editing with Svetlana Kito, the first major publication on the lesbian gallery Child Balloon. Her writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, among other publications. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ksenia to.
Thank you so much, Magali, and thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for making this possible. It's always a pleasure. And thank you to Andrea for joining me, and congratulations on your beautiful show, A Promise of Lightning, at the Leslie Lohman Museum. And here we have some images of the exhibition. You know, I was thinking this morning how grateful I am for this friendship and for the conversations that we've had and continue to have over the past 4 years. But of course, my knowledge of your work and my admiration for you goes much further back than that. And I'm always amused by the memory of how we technically first met about, I think, 10 years ago when I was a grad student at NYU, and I was at Bope's library, actually working on a paper about art as protest. And I went to the restroom, and there you were with your then very small children who had to use the restroom. And I was so starstruck. I was like, oh my God, you're Andrea Geyer. And we had a brief conversation then. But, you know, to me, you really represented in that moment and continue to what it means to be politically engaged as an artist, what it means to be a politically critical artist. And you do so in a way that also feels poetic, you know, and at its root, poesis simply means to create. And you create from that place where queer identity and political identity intersect. And well, as you know, in my opinion, they're inextricable. And you begin with a critical investigation. You begin with rigorous research, but then instead of presenting your findings in a way that feels didactic, you create an experience that really that invites the viewer into a somatic encounter where they actually get to experience the motions and emotions of those findings, right? And it's an encounter that in a way holds the feelings of those facts, which of course then makes me think of Yvonne Rainer and Feelings Are Facts, who is an important person in your life as well. So all of that is to say thank you for your critical and poetic mind. Thank you for being a friend. Thank you for being a mentor. Thank you for being a person in the world. And again, congratulations. So I would love to start by maybe having you talk a little bit, especially for those who haven't seen the show in person, at how you arrived at this project, A Promise of Lightning, and how it came to materialize at the Leslie Lohman.
Well, thank you so much, Ksenia, for your really warm and lovely introduction. And I think we both practice friendship as a way of life, right? Which you have been investigating in your work, and understand these conversation as a very deep, not just a starting point, but a form of maintaining one's own engagement with ideas, political questions. And I think it's also interesting. One thing I was thinking about yesterday was the fact that we're both immigrants to this country, and we both left specific cultural circumstances that we bring with that. And that because of that, I think we both live in a form of translation. In our everyday life, not just in terms of language, but in terms of culture, in terms of vantage point. And I've been thinking recently a lot about how one aspect of queer methodology is a form of translation. That because we often, what people I know who identify as LGBTQIA+, often experiences this, growing up in a body, in an experience that is unique and that's not marginal when we experience it first. It's who we are fully, and then this notion of it being different is something that we learn, and having children makes you see that even more poignantly. But maybe that's something I want to pin. I don't want to avoid your questions. But I thought it was interesting to set this as a kind of beginning, because I think when you live in a condition of translation, you understand that the task is not to come from point A to point B. The task is to live fully everything that's in between, because this is what we are, everything that's in between, right? And I'll get back to that a little bit later. But let me start out with this holding of this in-between space, I think, is a deeply queer practice. And that speaks a little bit to this exhibition that I was so fortunate to develop with the Leslie Lohman and Stamatina Grigori and the team at the museum. I was invited, I'm the second artist they invited to respond to the museum's extensive collections of artworks and of papers that they're holding and that they're continuously expanding also. Liz Collins actually was an artist who pointed out to me that they're looking to extend the collection, and with limited means, they're also looking for members of the community to donate work to them, which I did many years ago. And I started a conversation with Stamatina before they even started working at the museum about certain ideas and perspectives and vantage points we had on the interrelationship of art and politics, of politics and culture, of life and culture. So when they invited me to do this intervention or response, I spent a lot of time looking at the materials, mostly online. And then that was happening about a year ago, where also the continuous political, like the conditions around us socially, politically, were continuing to unravel, and I could feel this uptick in white supremacy, fascist, homophobic, racist kind of culture sweeping at me, and being exposed to it on all levels in my life, actually, as a person on the street, as a faculty teaching, as an artist, as a thinker. And I had studied the few years before, I had studied the kind of historical waves of fascism as they come and go over the last 100 years. And I had marked this kind of wave of fascism, of fascist tendencies in this country, in an earlier project. And I was like, oh yeah, now it's really picking up, and it's really nagging at my community. Not surprisingly, but that's what's happening again. And I was thinking, what am I doing with this museum that's dedicated to artists of this community making art? Like, what are aspects in this kind of cultural archive that I could respond to and engage with? And while I was thinking about that, I came across an envelope of photographs that I was shared that were snapshots of one of the early Christopher Street Day action days and protests. And I was really moved by these images because they were slightly different than what I had seen. I'd seen a lot of photographs that were published or circulated, because these were private photographs that were never meant to be shared or public. They had a different kind of gaze that I recognized within them. George Dudley, who was I think a director of the foundation early on of the Leslie Lohman, and these images were a part of his private papers. They were not considered artworks. And I could tell why, because it was really him taking pictures of his friends and colleagues and being excited in the moment, being in the midst of the scene. And what I was seeing in them was a certain kind of intersection that I was also looking for historically, like how queer communities have organized themselves in the face of adversity, in the face of negligence and violence. And so I started looking through the collection and found more images and photographs of protests, but also images of organizing, of people coming together around the AIDS crisis, but also beyond. And I pulled those images from the collection, and they became my kind of reference point to think about what people are, how people have come together historically. So then I realized that despite my kind of general knowledge of queer history in this country, I didn't know enough, and I started to study, which I often do. I go and try to find histories, official ones, oral histories also that are official histories. I try to understand the incredible work that people did in response to the AIDS crisis, how they really changed things and how they stopped what they were doing to further a cure, and how they supported each other, even across very sometimes wide divides of positionality. And I tried to study and learn from them. And in this process of research, I started to come across all these other organizations whose names I hadn't heard before. So I started accumulating a list and search more. And I realized that there's just an enormous landscape of queer organizing that exists, that is named and unnamed, that is maybe said in passing, or maybe one person who was part of this group mentions it, but it's not necessarily historicized. And I started to accumulate an archive around that. And while I was doing that research work, which is maybe very common to my practice at large, I often start with accumulating these archives, these very idiosyncratic archives, to then base my work on. I was also thinking about my own formation as an artist, as a young person, as a queer person, in the Black Forest in the south of Germany, near the border of France and Switzerland, which is a very rural region with a lot of pagan histories and a lot of pine forests that are agricultural forests. So they are not old growth, they're forest and planted and harvested. And it was the spaces that I grew up in as a kid. I grew up in the 70s. I wasn't allowed to watch television. I was sent, as long as there was no rain, I had to be out of the house. And my friends and I just hung out in the woods, and which was an incredibly nourishing place, and scary and fun, and importantly, away from the supervision of grown-ups and parents, and away from the expectations that were placed on me as a girl-born child. So I spent time there, and I started thinking about the way I experienced this space as a child, as a kind of place of organizing myself in relationship to or outside of the expectations that I was grown into, that I was born into, and started to see these overlaps of a space of organizing, less so as a metaphor, but more as a kind of framework that seemed to be helpful for me to think about what queer organizing is, and what queer organizing can be, and why it can be helpful in this moment. Because I was doing all of this work with the increase, with the kind of return of the Trump candidacy, the return of a certain kind of rhetoric around queer culture, the weaponization of so-called marginal groups, like queers, migrants, people of color, women. And I realized that I needed that kind of information and nurture of my own upbringing, the forest, and this kind of history that I was learning through the research I was doing. And the exhibition then is trying to kind of unfold that research, both the personal as well as the historical, and present them interlaced with each other.
Thank you.
I can speak more, but maybe I don't want to monologue, so I'm going to let you ask some questions.
Listen. No, but I was going to say that this exhibition is very much a follow-up to your exhibition at Hales Gallery about a year ago, in 2023, which was a video of the forest, multi-channel video that really explored the forest as this ideological construct, right? And how nature has been used to create hierarchies, create values, contain, and people in this country love to think that fascism is something that is just a European concept. And so could you maybe speak a little bit more to your investigation into these overlaps between white supremacy, fascism, and nature?
Yeah, thank you. I think, of course, one of the things that's clear, I think, to most of us in this room, people listen to this concept, that the idea of nature and the natural are deeply cultural concepts that people have used historically, particularly in Western cultures, where the image of nature, or the kind of experience of nature, is there to justify very specific ideological frameworks. Like, for example, in Germany, where Hitler and Goebbels were very invested to kind of frame Germans as forest people. And they did that in a clear attempt to separate Germans out from the so-called desert people that they were, setting themselves apart of. And the idea of the oak tree as the kind of towering tree over, the lower underwoods. All this rhetoric was very integrated also in school books and in kind of cultural, like movies and films, Riefenstahl, early Leni Riefenstahl films. And of course, it's something that he actually was very inspired by a man named Madison Grant. And those of you who have studied the history of the parks, the national parks in America, know that Madison Grant, alongside with John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, who were all friends, created this concept of national parks in America. The parks, of course, were mostly created to be a kind of nurturing space for white communities. They were established through the removal of the traditional and modern day owners of these lands, indigenous communities, and often also black farmers. And the land was taken away and put under the government to become these kind of wilderness that needed to be stewarded under the idea of these men, particularly Grant and Moyer. And for Madison Grant, we're talking early 20th century. So for Madison Grant, this stewardship of nature was something that he could very easily move into also what he considered the stewardship of humans, eugenics, which all of these ideas he published in 1919 or 1916 in a book titled The Passing of the Great Race. That book, in one way or another, made it into the hand of a young corporal named Adolf Hitler, who then in the early 1920s wrote to Madison Grant multiple fan letters calling Madison Grant's book his Bible, because it gave him language and tools to build his ideological framework. So I'm really interested, it's maybe where we started out with, these questions of translation, right? This idea of bringing all these different knowledges across different cultural vantage points, and to understand how deeply intertwined Hitler's vision of fascist Germany was with certain ideas that circulated in this country, and then in retour also has been something that's been terrifying and interesting to me to look at, and important to look at. And so for me then when I started to think about a few years ago that I really wanted to kind of address the forest as a space of my own formation, I realized that I had to address the forest as an ideological framework first. Because of course, when I was a kid roaming these woods, I had no idea of any of this, right? And then you start learning about the way the forest was framed in German fascist ideology, and it doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me as a kid. And it felt this idea of like nonsense, not making sense, not speaking true to my experience is something that I wanted to kind of pull out. Without, needing to romanticize the forest. I think the forest doesn't care how we perceive it or how it is represented, but it is actually, as we now are registering, because I think this has been known to indigenous communities for all over the world forever, is that this way in which the forest is really an intricate network of cross-pollination and support, where like birch trees that you often find in pine and needle woods are literally fed sugars by the pines during the leafless seasons. This is something that scholars, biologists have figured out by now, and many people have probably read these books, The Secret Life of Trees and The Mother Tree, that really unpack this research. So the forests are not hierarchical structure, has never been a hierarchical structure. It's always been a whole different kind of organism that is about survival, but survival across generations, across different species, in kind of communication. And I'm interested in that, to think through that, or use that as a framework to think about what kind of organizations we need now. The project you're referring to, Never Yet, which was shown at Hales Gallery in March of 2023, is a multi-channel video installation that looks at the forest, but not in a kind of, not unlike this work. It breaks up the forest into different segments and kind of lets the image of the forest, the moving image of the forest, continually reorganize itself towards you as a viewer. which is something that I've been really interested in, is like, how do I represent nature, not in the sense that a camera has represented traditionally over many years, which is through a landscape, which is a landscape is an image of land, but it's always also an image of a one singular viewpoint that organizes this landscape accordingly to this viewpoint. And I'm, in my work, continuously interested in opening up this dominant mode of organization, of visualization, and trying to create images and in these two cases, landscapes that withdraw themselves from this kind of organization and become precarious in that sense, in relationship to you as a viewer, which connects these works. And this new work, just to kind of make that loop, I think from Never Yet, which really addresses that specific history of the intersection or the relationship of ideological frameworks in this country and in Germany around nature, and kind of unpacks these different layers of that. I felt with this work, now I could return to really thinking about this other kind of forest that nurtured my queer self, that allowed me to feel whole and to feel kind of cared for in this environment as a kid.
I just recently, hearing you speak about that, I was listening to a podcast, and I realized somebody was saying that actually Darwin never said survival of the fittest. He said survival of the fit took place. And that then was appropriated by Herbert Spencer, who practiced social Darwinism into survival of the fittest. So we've built our entire society around this flawed idea. And I so relate to your experience of the forest and of nature as a queer kid, as a place where you can actually run wild, right? And of course, Jack Halberstam has done a lot of work on this, on this idea of wildness as a queer experience. And, as a kid in Russia, I was mostly outside as well. That was a safe place. And it was okay to wear boys' clothes if you spent your day climbing trees, and I would love to hear what it was like for you for this project back in Germany, spend a lot of time with your mom, and to actually be making this work, taking these photographs, making these prints, and then also how you, because as you can see, Andrea has stitched words and sentences into the silk screens, and I would love to hear more about how you write and the role that writing.
Well, I do want to kind of note, I think it's important for me, it has been important for me to acknowledge that many people do not, particularly here, do not experience the forest as a safe space or as a space of like the way that I have perceived it. And I think for me, I realized that it's, in that sense, it's a framework. It doesn't have to be the forest, as a kind of reference point, but it's this place a place where one can be. And for me, this was the forest, and for you too, I hear you say, in a certain way.
It looks like potato fields, but
yeah. Exactly. Could be potato fields, could be this other place, right? This place outside of these very often very strong cultural frameworks into which we grow up into.
I mean, really humans. It's like the place outside of the cruelty of humans.
Yeah, exactly. Probably that is good. What's interesting for me is exactly this when this translation happens, or when this shift happens, when you realize that there is this kind of like reconfiguration. I always early on in my work, I did a project about this text by Bertolt Brecht that he wrote, when he was fleeing the Nazis. It's called Conversations Among Refugees. It's a theater play. And in that play, he says, well, dirt is just soil in the wrong spot. And I always really like that as a concept, right? To really bring myself back to that, is that language and therefore also culture is reconditioning things, you know, in one way or another according to a particular ideological need. So soil or weeds, right? That this concept, this very Western concept of weeds versus plants. I mean, we can go on and on and on about how there are all these examples in the natural world where that shift, when they are used culturally or when they're addressed culturally, happens. So this idea of, I always felt addressed somehow in this with the saying that dirt is just soil in the wrong place, what that speaks for my own perception. So it's this shifting that I feel the forest is helpful to materialize. It was, for me to go back to this space was very meaningful. I really tried, this entire exhibition is there to create a space to be, and to breathe and to ground oneself in this moment of continuous attack towards many things that are dear to me. And to go to Germany to photograph, and then to be at the Lower East Side print shop to make these prints was a form of grounding myself and trying to not get carried away in responsiveness only to the attacks, and remind myself, like you go to these meetings, these New York City school district meetings, and they are these people who just stand up and say trans children don't exist, and of course I know that's wrong, and I know that that's a politically motivated attack that has very little to do actually with trans children, but it kind of eats on the ground that I stand on, also socially, politically, and I don't only want to respond from the place of rage, but I want to also have time within rage to ground myself and to be what are the strategies that we need in this very moment to respond to this to these attacks that happen all around us. So the exhibition is hopefully, or I created this work as a place of grounding for myself, and hopefully in inviting or offering it to others to do so. And the text, I think, the texts I wrote in response to the research I did and the books that I read about the histories of queer organizing. So I would mostly listen to a lot of the books I could find on tape while I was printing. So I was thinking about these histories while making and unmaking these images of my childhood. And I would just jot down notes and ideas and phrases that came up. It's a process of learning. I feel like I was learning. On the one hand, I was relearning something that was intuitive there for me as a child. And then I was also learning a history that I'm, getting more and more familiar with, but I'm not an expert in. And putting these two different learnings at the same time, a kind of relearning of a somatic, of a kind of bodily presence, and a learning of a history that's an intellectual presence, and then see how these things really become one in my experience. And this is also how the poems, I wrote straight out poems that then I would have around the studio, and then started to cut up and place them. In the beginning, the poems were just like supposed to be just a single poem somewhere in the sewn onto the papers that I printed on. And then I realized, no, I would separate something that's not separate in my comprehension or my experience anymore. I wanted them to be, I was understanding these poems as part of these images. They weren't separated. So the literal stitching of them into the paper was a kind of mending of intellectual recognition of things and a bodily recognition of things, a kind of aim of really tangibly bringing them together and letting you find these words and find yourself in the image through the words and find the words through the image as well. So you cannot see them separately. You have to engage them together automatically. And I really appreciate, it's wonderful to have an exhibition up in the town you live that you can visit and you can watch people engage with the work. It's such a blessing to have, or such a wonderful thing to have as an artist. And it's been really great to really watch people have this experience where they look at the work and they might not see the words because they're kind of hidden, and then suddenly they find a word, and then they kind of like search this image like a map or like a text, and then they step back to see the image again. And maybe one thing that really doesn't translate at all in photography, sadly, is that important to mention is that these screen prints are made with iridescent ink. So they look different from whichever angle you look at them. So movement in itself is part of what I like to generate. I always try to make work where people are invited or seduced or called for moving around to actually engage with the images and the text itself, so that we feel, when we move, we feel ourselves, right? We feel ourselves in a very different kind of way. Even if we just move our head, like there's something where a relationship is built between the work and the viewer, which is something I'm really interested in, that I feel a work doesn't really exist outside it being viewed. And this kind of interrelationship is where the meaning happens, in this like translation that's not a translation. I'm interested in opening up that space between any viewer and the work itself. And the words, for me, are as much images as the images are words. Like I bring them together, and I feel at peace with that. I think that's how things should be. People have asked me if I would publish the poems, but I would never publish them outside of the image. They make no sense as words without the image they're on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is a very conscious negation of the medium of photography that is happening here as well. Through the ink and just like really challenging this history of modernist photography, landscape photography, which then also results in an image that is very ghostly, very haunted. And of course it is, this very Derrida's idea of ontology, that the present is always haunted by the past, how that relates to fascism and all of that. But also on a very personal level, it does make me think of your project, Feeding the Ghost, and it's your first exhibition that I wrote about back in 2019, which was engaging with Chantal Akerman, and kind of like a love letter to Chantal Akerman, and interwove your personal history with her history, and of course she interweaves her history with her history, etc. And I feel that from that exhibition on, or maybe it's because from that point on I became more engaged with your work on a personal level, but I do feel that Feeding the Ghost, Never Yet, and now your work, there is an increasingly autobiographical turn. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, and if so, what do you think is driving that?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I want to kind of do one note before, or maybe that is already addressing that. I studied photojournalism, so that's my training, really. I did also some years in an art academy, but I think my formative training was photojournalism with very socially engaged photojournalists who had their headies in the 70s and 80s, like Jürgen Heinemann, which is not somebody who's known here, but really was an important figure in my understanding of how the questions around ethics and images is where I come from in my training. And then I did one of the first projects that I made when I moved to the US is a project that actually looks at the history of photography and colonialism, and looks, my project Spiral Lands, which I worked on over many years. It has 3 chapters, and it looks at the violence of photography in the colonization project as an integral part of it, and how violent it was to create these images that were part of the surveys and explorations and exploitations of the American West. And through that, I was lucky enough to make friendships, very meaningful friendships that last to this day, with people whose families traditionally lived there and grew up there, and who taught me a very different kind of understanding of this country early in my time here. And I think this project, Spiral Lands, really pushed my understanding of the camera as a tool onto a different register, and treating it very warily as a tool in my practice. And you see that in the way that I think where I'm now, that I'm still working with the camera, and I work with silver and referring to the history of silver gelatin and this kind of, it's always there, like you cannot undo that. That history is present and is important, but it also has to be represented with the violence that comes with it. It never exists outside. And I think that Chantal Akerman, who I also was very lucky to meet in the early 2000s, and who really taught me that art is a very important form of story making and storytelling. That encounter with Chantal was happening when I was working on the project in the Southwest and Spiral Lands. So she really informed my capacity of never trusting the image on its own, but engaging it with words and with storytelling. And it felt appropriate to really spend a moment and think about that, think about my relationship to Chantal, the way in which her history as a child of Holocaust survivors, my history that involves Nazis, we're of this other generation that then looks back and learns from in all these critical ways, through images, through storytelling, how to make sense of this knowledge in this present moment, and how it activates us as cultural makers in this moment. So Feeding the Ghost very much works with that, also works with slide projectors as a very traditional photographic form, but it projects the light, just the light, and evokes the question of image making alongside. So I feel that it was really also then Akerman who, I can't really tell, in retrospect, one can narrate these things really neatly up one next to another. But I think there was a recognition that with the kind of tangible discomfort I was feeling in this country, with a kind of like having these moments in that time when I worked on Feeding the Ghosts, these white supremacists rearing their head as soon as Obama stepped into the White House, right? I kept an archive of that. I started to keep an archive of that, and I feel, as somebody, I've been trying to get away from fascism my whole life, and then at a certain moment you just have to realize it's everywhere, and we have to continuously fight it wherever it is and however it shows up, in small and in large ways. And I think that this, in this moment, when I started to think about Akerman after her passing, I started to think about her again, and to realize that I have to acknowledge this kind of formation that is underlying in my whole practice, that I grew up in Germany. I'm a product of what you call memory culture, and in all its kind of potency and all its limitations that we're currently seeing unfold. and to really become differently aware of these things was important for me to move forward with my own work. So looking at Ackermann, looking at more biographical questions of my own formation, looking at my family's history. The next project I'm working on, Scratching the Surface from Below, really is going to be very biographical. So to understand that there's something in there that I'm still learning, right? I make my work learning about myself and how this knowledge could also be helpful to others or be helpful in dialogue with others.
Yeah. And also Ackermann was like you, somebody who, in terms of storytelling, who started from a place, who could create a story from a place of silence or a place of lack. You know, she said something along the, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, you know, if my family had nothing to say about their history, I made films about silence, right? And so much of your work is looking at the gaps, the silences in the archive, in this country's history, in your personal history, and then creating a story from that space.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because I really have been thinking about this a lot. But this way in which you know, Ackermann herself, who was queer, like there is something around absence, and that I've become more and more interested in, because it's you know, Sarah Ahmed has given me this really important kind of language around this need to orient myself, you know, like what does it mean to be oriented? And I've been really interested in thinking about how we orient ourselves, or how I feel like one of the many queer methodologies is to orient ourselves at absences or around absences, and not with the aim to materialize what's missing only, sometimes yes, but not exclusively, but also as a form of respecting and acknowledging a certain kind of refusal or a certain kind of absence, and still insisting that we orient ourselves around these things, I think is something I find in my own practice, and also in practices of artists and friends that I follow, you know, that this is something we really do compulsively. And I think it has to do with this, for me at least, I can speak for myself, it has to do with this way in which this discrepancy of being something somewhere could, like, feeling fully whole, and then culturally the marginal, the supposed marginal identity I was carrying then was produced culturally, where the wholeness couldn't reflect itself, right? I grew up in a relatively provincial environment. You know, there was no images of anything queer in my surrounding for a long time. So to then recognize these two, it's an absence in oneself, right? It's a certain kind of absence presence in oneself that one materializes as an LGBTQAI plus person, and lives when it lives through. And it's a translation around these things. But really, what I recently thought is that it's and Ackermann definitely taught me that, but also other writers and thinkers and artists, is this way in which what art can do, I think, so wonderfully, is that it can release these ghosts, you know, let them out of the bag, or create this opening through which they can materialize without the work necessarily materializing it. But they can conjure this presence of an absence, which is not really an absence. It's really, that's why I like the term ghost. You know, it's again another form of approximating what I'm interested in. But it's holding that thing that's obviously there, and obviously really impactful on this present moment that we're living in. But it's not often accessible as something to orient oneself towards or orient oneself from.
And it also, again, goes back to what we started with in terms of translation and not, you know, spending so much of your life actually not existing in the language that English language, right? And that in between space as a space of productive failure, right? And a space of awkwardness and a space of slipperiness. And when you're saying, the fact, or at least what I'm hearing you say, is that the fact that there is an absence doesn't mean that there is not meaning, and it makes me think of, coming to a new country. And, for me, it was, I first came from Russia to the Netherlands, and being in the country where you don't speak the language and you have something to say, but you can't say it, right? There is an absence. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a meaning, right? And yeah, and just existing in that in between space.
Yeah, and also I think it makes me think about how then being this in this precarious situation of not being of a culture but in a culture, right, is also this way in which the way you're perceived. I mean, it's like one thing, we are putting ourselves out, but also the way we're constructed externally, you have to constantly consider and rethink, like the way you're looked at, the way like people, these frameworks, right? The pattern recognition that people bring to understand what you're saying, of course, produces all of these boxes that people are fit into, and that are stronger, like for some people than for other people, that we have to constantly resist or kind of transgress forward to create meaning, and to this is why an image is I can only ever produce an image that's precarious. I can only ever produce a poem that's precarious, and because I need that kind of presence absence that I consider with precarity, right? Is that it's there, but it's not totally fully there. So you can it's its own form of refusal or resistance or kind of skating, a kind of like indigenous friends use the term trickster, this kind of idea of a shapeshifter or a trickster. That's part of existing or maintaining oneself.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we get to talk about the chairs that you see in the middle of the exhibition space. And, I just from the last two shows at Hale, in the Ghost and Planning, Never Yet, I've become so used to voiceover in your work. I've become so used to entering a space and immediately there being sound as part of that immersive experience, and that is not the case here. Even the video is actually silent, but you are activating the space in a different way because the chairs are set up for a series of salons that you're doing that are almost weekly. And can you talk a little bit more about that decision and how it has gone so far and what we have coming up, and just the format of salon at large?
I think that for me, I've always considered art to be something I want to hang out with. I want to spend time with. It's like a place to be, actually. Like rather than a place to like go, consume and leave, it's like a place I want to stay with or stay in. And of course, the studio is that, but in an ideal space, the museum or a gallery is the same thing. I want to really make a point that people are welcome to spend time with something or with an idea or with a concept. I mean, yeah, thank you for putting that image up. There's maybe something to mention, the research that I mentioned earlier around all these organizations I'd never heard of. I put together an archive of about 1,000 of them, which is just a drop in the bucket of organizations that existed in the last few hundred years in what we call America. And that's kind of at the center of these chairs. So the chairs are there for you to kind of sit down, hang out with the work, and also read some of this. You can also take that newsprint with you. But the idea of the salon is maybe something important to unpack a little bit further. The salon is a form that most people are probably familiar with, but what I'm interested in it is that it's a form of gathering that inherently is social and often political or cultural in nature. So people who set up salons were ready for it to be social occasions where people dressed up for, but it was also an opportunity often for where I came across them, the women who were at the center of modernism in America, who set up these salons because it allowed them to bring in people they could not meet in any other form or shape. And they couldn't really make it a formal dinner, nor could they invite them officially to a meeting. So the salon was a kind of covert form that was social, but really acted as a place of organizing. And I feel it's something, if I look at different historical movements, this idea of creating frameworks that are one thing and another, and you don't quite know what it is, and they're not documented, and they kind of just happen, and they're often loud, and there's music, and there's maybe some drinks, so you can't totally hear it. There's a way in which they're really interesting forms of getting stuff done that people have employed in all these different variations, maybe not always calling these things salons. But I took that format and went with it to try to bring together different people to create a framework where people could kind of think together. Hannah Arendt, who's a complicated figure who shows up in my work on and off, had this salon called the Ghost Hour, Geisterstunde, for the people who speak German in this room, which I really loved as a format. I ran a salon at the Museum of Modern Art called The Hour, where I brought together all these different kind of people to just look at one artwork for an hour. And it created the most interesting conversations. Here, Come Out with Joy, Speak Out for Justice, which of course is a very famous slogan, the salon that's part of this exhibition, I really kept open because I'm also still trying to figure out what it is we need to come together around. And the salons have come together by people just asking me if they could have a salon in the space, and me offering it to them, or say, what is it that you need right now? What is the thing you need right now to talk about? So with my friend and colleague Ariel Goldberg, we talked about boycott. With my friend and colleague Sean, we talked about queer hair, like very different topics, but they are really important in this moment, and they speak to so many different things. We had a really wonderful conversation with the Interference Archive and Sam Feder around queer archives, the kind of the specificity of them, the importance of them, the kind of fraudness of them, also with like an incredible group of people who came out to just be together in a room and think how archives operate for them, and where they fail them, how they make them. So there's another one coming up on trans fitness, this question of like what kind of space is there for trans people to have a kind of fitness space, to be comfortable in their body, to talk about health, talk about sports, talk about these things. And we gonna have one with Katie Madison around checking in, like, are we okay? Like, are we really okay? What does that mean to be with each other? You can find the list that's ever changing on the website. For Leslie Lohman, my own personal website, there's a link. We're gonna have one on decolonial strategies for institutions with Emily Johnson and Jane Anderson. We're going to have one around Brooke O'Hara's new book, Who's in the Room, that looks at queer performance, directing and acting. So very different topics, but they all kind of talk about what is it that communities need right now. And the topics are really just an entry point, and then people who come to the salons are really the ones who make the conversation. Because there's no moderation in a kind of simple sense that keeps us on target or something like that. Horrible language I'm using, but keeps us focused on an idea. But it's really there to come together, to think together with the trust and faith that this is something that people need, that I need, and that can generate things that we need to be ready for. No matter who wins these elections, different things will happen in very different levels of injury. But I think whoever wins the election, there's a lot of work ahead that needs to be done socially, politically, culturally also.
Yeah. I know that we're running out of time, but I really do want to ask you to speak about the banners as well. Go to an image of the banners that are exhibited in the Leslie Lohman windows, and also are about to be shown in the Sales Gallery. You have a show opening this Friday, and they were shown in Pittsburgh, and then at the Gropiusbau in Berlin. And this is such an amazing project that you've been working on for a long time, Manifest, and it very much continues your engagement with institutions and really tackling power structures inherent in institutions. And I think it's so tempting to say, let's burn it all down and reinvent the wheel, and instead you are actually, I think, asking a more productive question, which is, I've said this before, how can we have institutions hand over their power? How can we have them hand over authority? And so I guess that is my question. And what is the role of institutions today, particularly in this moment? And how can artists engage with institutions in a way that is destructively productive or productively?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you I wanted to talk about these banners too. This is a project called Manifest that actually it makes this arch back to research I did on the women who were at the center of American modernism, particularly Grace McCann Morley, a name that many people don't know. She was the founding director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s. She's probably the most important American museologist out there. She was removed from her post in the 50s as part of the Lavender Scare because she was a lesbian. The thing that she really made me realize or made me excited about is that 100 years ago, she mapped out that at the core of a modern art museum is that it's a civic institution that should always be at the service to the communities that surround it. And what was interesting to me when I did this project in 2017 was that you might remember it was this moment where, because of the Trump administration's ban and a ban of certain immigrants and enforcement of ICE, museums were trying to be sanctuary places. Some were more actively, and we as artists asked the museum to become sanctuary spaces. There's a lot of meetings that I participated in, and I realized in these meetings that she already had understood that museum foundationally to be that space over 100 years ago. And I had written a script for a video that I made responding to her ideas with the same title, Manifest. And that was basically a list of demands and wants that I felt was partially her voice, partially my voice, partially the voice of friends and colleagues that I was in conversation with at the time. And I started intuitively reading the script in these political meetings, where I was just like, let's stop talking about the museum, let's stop what we want. Like, what is it that we want? What is it that we need in this moment urgently from these institutions? Because I like to understand that the museums and art spaces are, when they're at their best, they're really precious, because a lot of things can happen there that can't happen anywhere else, that can't happen in politics when you organize politically. Like, anybody who has ever tried to get anything done politically knows that it's a lot of negotiation and compromising and, you know, like skirting around things to get things done. In art, there's like we can ideally hold a lot of very difficult questions at the same time with each other across different barriers. And I really, at that time already and still today, believe that I want to kind of protect that space as much as possible. Of course, it doesn't evade me the kind of deeply problematic spaces, particularly museums in this country are, because of their funding structure and because of their structure. But what's important to me is what this project does, and it's a little bit different to your question actually, and it's important to me, is what I realized is reading Morley's writing is that I had internalized a lot of limits around what can happen in a museum preemptively, you know, through being part of institutional structures my whole life, dealing with museums as an artist in all these different forms, that I had internalized limits. And what Manifest really is inviting people to do is to kind of crack open their own limits around what they imagine should happen in that space. So that's why it says I want and not we want. It's like, it's really a kind of meditation, a poetic verbalizing practice to speak out loud what it is that we want, and to open up our imagination and grow this idea. And the list of the wants has grown, you know, significantly since I first wrote the script, and does continuously. And I'm really glad to see people. I really want to give a shout out to Dana Bishop-Root, who's the public program director at the Carnegie, who, in a conversation about Morley, we talked about this project and her needs, and we talked about you know, how radical that still feels, and how I feel like it's not there for us to orient ourselves towards, to go back to Ahmed's way of thinking. And I wanted this work, these ideas, to be something to orient ourselves towards, so we can also focus on what we can do within ourselves as artists, as curators, as writers, to reimagine what that space is ongoingly. And I said to Dana, I really would love to make these banners, and I want to hang them off all of these big institutions. And she invited me to do that at the Carnegie last year. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity, because it made me really go deeper into the project. There's also a newsprint that comes with it that has the list of all of them. We're doing them in different languages, but it's really for audiences to re-own this space that gets continuously alienated away from us. Because many people that I spoke to in Pittsburgh particularly were like saying to me, Dana's working with a lot of communities around Pittsburgh, and organized some dinners and to have conversations. And one of the things people were like, oh, it never occurred to me to ask what I want. I'm always like, the museum should do this and this and this, but to really just kind of take a step back and be like, no, I want this to be a swimming pool with sculptures floating in where I can swim with the art, you know, which is of course not something that should be translated, but it points to a way how we want to relate to artistic practice that can get lost sometimes in a form, a very important form of institutional critique that many colleagues have done. And I do want to also say that, because I think that project wasn't totally seen this way, but this, I feel, manifests this very much also in dialogue with Strike MoMA, which tried to also make us think about, to reimagine that space. You know, like I think it was sometimes some communities understood as a kind of burn the museum down, but I actually feel like if you engage with their pedagogy and the reading lists and all the events that were happening, they were doing something similar to that, you know, where it's like, no, let's create a working group where we can think and rethink outside of these pre-given confinements that we find ourselves in relation towards.
And something that your work achieves, I think, is exactly showing that the collective is made up of individuals, right? Collective memory is made up of individual memories. Collective demands are made up of individuals. Yeah. So looking at the collective through the individual. Methodology. Andrea, thank you so much. I'm gonna
thank you, Ksenia.
I will open up the floor for all those questions.
Thank you both so much. That was so enlightening. I'm going to kick us off with questions. The first question is from GE. And GE asks, how did you hit upon this rich humus of calmness that so draws us into patterns of deeper and deeper ways of meaning?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's this, what I said earlier, this question, like going back to some of the privilege that I had of having that childhood, you know, like this idea of grounding ourselves, you know, and not, I've been feeling myself be very reactive continuously because the onslaught is so ongoing. And it's a certain kind of way of grounding myself, refusing a continuous reactiveness, because I really am trying to find strategy in all of this madness, a kind of strategy of organizing, of making art, of seeing what art can do as a space of calming or organizing or bringing us to a space where we can hear ourselves think again, you know, and to kind of insist in that as a really important space of political, like of imagination, of political change, of movement making.
Thank you for that question, GE, and thank you for the answer, Andrea. The next person to ask a question will be Min. Go ahead, Min.
Thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed hearing about this whole translation process and the precarity of sort of everything that you are working with, how you're enjoying kind of being in the in-between space and questioning this in-between space instead of trying to get from point A to B. The social aspect that you're trying to bring into your work, I find that quite interesting in comparison to your work, because there are images that are also sort of brought together. Sometimes they're sewn together, other times they're slightly away from one another, but in groupings. And I was wondering if you're thinking about like social aspect and creating places of being also involve images.
Mm-hmm. So just the groupings of photographs, just to clarify, you know, that we have seen in the images, those are not my photographs. Those are photographs from the collection. So they are by really brilliant photographers like Jab and Anne Meredith and Diana Davis and all the kind of important documentarians of my community. And through what was beautiful for me to look at in these photographs, these some of them journalistic, some of them art photography, was the way in which the kind of small gestures of intimacies that are documented in those images were something I found very familiar, and I was also trying to do in my own work, the sewn together screen prints. This idea of what does it mean, like what does it mean to physically lean into somebody, when you're standing next to them at a protest, and what does that mean to intellectually or historically lean into something, right? Because that's what the work is trying to do. It's trying to maybe evoke something that we that some of us are very familiar with, is this kind of need of just leaning into an idea, into a story, into a person, can be exactly what we need to be able to move forward, or to propose ideas or change, or think more critically, think more radically, outside of the box. You need that kind of framework. And I was trying to evoke this in a very physical way through these amazing elders and colleagues and contemporaries that photographed, made these images, and then to offer something beyond the body, the human body, as a reference as well. So this is the kind of this relationship. I don't know if I answered your question. Did I answer your question? Please go on. Tell more.
No, you did. I was just kind of curious about the process of bringing images together, and I think that kind of answered my question perfectly. It makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Thank you for a beautiful talk.
Thank you so much, Min and Andrea. And then we have one last question from Fong. I'll let you go ahead and ask, Fong.
Thank you so much. It's not a question, rather it's an acknowledgement of how wonderful this whole conversation really is. I admire the work, as I'm also now am reading the beginning of this remarkable 14 women who founded the Modern Museums. Is added now by my friend Anne Tamkin there. So there have been worked collectively. You mentioned about the legendary founder of San Francisco Museum. But one of the things that I find extremely frustrating is the momentum get built and got disintegrated. And I remember when Women's March, we all went down. So many of us went down the day after Trump inauguration. And for some reason, the momentum was never kept up either, So it's, I don't know how we going to sustain this really. So I think the idea of get involved in the institutional level, like the way that Rosa Luxemburg in her famous book, Reform of Revolution, is very important at this moment as a re-questioning that whole perpetual struggle as an inquiry. But I think this is a very good beginning, because I feel impending to the election, as you both also talk about in the tail end, rather see it as a detrimental, potentially, however, whoever ended up being the next president. I think the work is really at the very beginning. So I just admire the fact that you've been leading this effort, this activism, and I hope that we can continue to further along, bringing in our friends to talk about this. And one of the things that we are so thrilled to rail at the NSE is now we have amassed over 1,100 something episodes. Mackley could correct me and let us know how many we have done. But this is a very beginning, Andrea, And I know that Ksenia is committed as much as we are. So let's continue to talk, because this is conversation number one. So please keep us, updated with your activities and be in touch. And we would love to further along this conversation again. So congratulations and thank you. And yeah, thank you for the conversation also with Ksenia. Wonderful moderation as usual. So back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fong. And yes, it is our 1119th episode today.
And if I may, Fong, thank you. And you know, we've been kind of talking about this form of organizing. What's interesting about this Anne's book that I haven't seen yet, but the work I did on called Revolt They Said, right, which maps all these women out. That's accessible online. It's these layers of histories available to us, including this archive of the conversations. There's so many that I've listened to over the years, is we don't have to invent ourselves from scratch. I think we need to build up. We can go 100 years back, you know, we can go hundreds of years back and look at all these different layers of history that we're standing literally on top of, that can inform ourselves how to address this another crisis at hand, across different communities, right? Also across the people who identify as women, people who identify as LGBTQ, and all these different communities. There's so much knowledge. If we bring it together, I think this is what we need to do more. And thank you for all the work you do at the Rail to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'll give you a chance to introduce the reading that you will close us up with. I'll also share the video as well to play it inside while you read.
Thank you so much. And it fits, couldn't fit better, but a poem that I've had up on my studio wall for many years, that was written only a couple of years after I was born, by the incredible teacher and elder Audre Lorde, called Movement Song, that gifted me the title for this project and this exhibition. Of course, I'm assuming I don't need to introduce who Audre Lorde is: a writer, a poet, a mother, a feminist, civil rights advocate, and more. She confronted the issues of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia while staying dedicated to change in the world. And I think this is why she has been so influential on me. I couldn't do what I do without her work. So I'm going to read Movement Song. I have studied the tight curls on the back of your neck, moving away from me beyond anger or failure. Your face in the evening school of longing, through mornings of wish and ripen. We were always saying goodbye, in the blood, in the bone, over coffee, before dashing to the elevators going in opposite directions without goodbyes. Do not remember me as a bridge, nor a roof, as a maker of legends, nor as a trap door to that world where black and white clericals hang on the edge of beauty in 5 o'clock elevators, twitching their shoulders to avoid other flesh, and now there's someone to speak for them. Moving away from me into tomorrow's morning of wish and ripen, your goodbye is a promise of lightning, in the last angel's hand, unwelcome and warning. The sands have run out against us. We were rewarded by journeys away from each other, into desire, into mornings alone, where excuse and endurance mingle, conceiving decision. Do not remember me as a disaster, nor as the keeper of secrets. I am a fellow rider in the kettle cars, watching. You move slowly out of my bed, saying, we cannot waste time, only ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was such a great way to conclude us today. Give me 1 second. Thank you so much, Andrea and Ksenia. Thank you, Samatina, Amy, and Julia from Leslie Lohman Museum of Art for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the TATE Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the program and making these daily conversations possible and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Danny Moynihan and Jason Rosenfeld on the event of In Praise of Limestone at Natalie Card Gallery. And as is Rail tradition, you may now all unmute yourselves and say hello and goodbye as you leave.
Hello.
Thank you
so
you.
much.
Thank
Such a
you.
fantastic
Thank you,
conversation.
Ksenia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ksenia.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank